Okay, welcome back to another lesson in period 8. We're going to be looking today at the spreading culture of protest in the 1970s. We want to start today back in the realm of African American rights. We know as the civil rights movement was changing after Selma that there was a splintering, a loss of the consensus as the movement spread geographically as well as philosophically. And so we want to take a look here at a video on the Black Panthers and the origins of the Black Power movement.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
On April 4th, 1968, the tragic assassination of Dr. King, beloved symbol of the civil rights struggle, shattered African Americans' faith that racial equality could ever be won through peaceful protest.
There were those who never believed in nonviolence because they never understood the depth of that method of solving problems in the world. To some extent, Dr. King has been a buffer the last few years between the black community and the white community. The white people do not know it, but the white people's best friend is dead.
Once King was assassinated, the politics of nonviolence lost their relevance for a large number of people. Everyone had some very deeply visceral response of what they wanted to do. And what many people wanted to do was just go burn.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles.
Race riots rock New Jersey's largest city. It's as if a flight of bombers has passed over Detroit.
Across the country, some African Americans who had patiently withstood injustice for decades now set their cities on fire in a spontaneous outpouring of despair and anger. But in Oakland, California, people had somewhere else to turn: the Black Panther Party, a militant group started in 1966 to defend the city's black community.
People jammed the Black Panther offices saying, "We want guns, we want guns, we have to do something about this."
By April 1968, the Panthers had gone from promoting self-defense to advocating revolutionary change.
If you consider a civil right a right protected by the government, in terms of legislation, civil rights were accomplished. Obviously, something hadn't happened to make black people equal, available, and have access to the resources. So that's power. That's where the Black Panther Party came in. It's for the people who want to bring about change.
22-year-old Kathleen Neal was working for racial justice through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But the rising call for black power awakened her desire for something more radical. After meeting Panther Minister of Information Eldridge Cleaver, Kathleen moved west, married Cleaver, and took charge of communications for the party.
The question is not, will it be nonviolence versus violence, but whether a human being can practice his God-given right of self-defense.
The Panthers came up with their own bold new solution to the long-standing problem of police harassment in the ghetto: armed community patrols.
They just assume their Second Amendment rights. They say, we have the right to defend ourselves under this Constitution, and we're going to do it openly and publicly.
We would have power to determine the destiny of our community. We would not be subjected to police brutality. And that was a pretty direct take in the streets with their weapons, patrolling the police. It was something that the Oakland police had never encountered.
Their in-your-face attitude infuriated the authorities. But it thrilled young people, impatient with the slow progress toward racial equality. The Panthers summoned the people they called the Brothers on the Block to realize the goal defined by their black nationalist forebears like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. black self-empowerment.
The Panthers are really saying they want guns and butter. Guns to defend the community. The butter is community programs.
Way over 6,000 bags of groceries are being given away free.
Free breakfast programs. Free sickle cell anemia programs. Health clinics.
Raise our own money. We didn't take grants. It was a community-based, popular, radical black organization, completely independent, and we didn't have to answer to anyone.
What kind of future for the African American people did the Panthers envision?
A brilliant future.
The trouble was, the Panthers could feed all the children they wanted to, but America wasn't going to tolerate black people standing up to the police. By 1968, the FBI had launched a massive operation aimed at bringing down the entire Black Power movement.
I remember when I would come to New York, FBI would be trailing me. They weren't hiding the fact that they were trailing. We thought that they were going to set us up and kill us or make somebody else kill us. What we had no idea is they basically wanted to confuse us and make us think that people who were our enemies were our friends, and people who were our friends were our enemies, and mislead us.
But while the government could arrest, confound, and even kill the Black Power leadership, it couldn't stop the spread of their ideas. The Black Panthers were not alone. The Black Power movement inspired a whole generation who had stopped asking for freedom and were now demanding it.
It's time we stand up and take over. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power. Everybody, what do you want? That's what we're gonna get.
Almost overnight, Black Power groups were organizing across the country, each with their own idea about what the phrase actually meant.
You got everybody from those that are saying, yes, let's go for elected office, to those that say, let's overthrow the government.
But not everyone was on board with the new slogan.
Now, we don't believe in black power. That's the wrong word. That's a dirty word.
There are certain segments of African American communities that just really believe that black power is disruptive, that it's wrong, that it's violent, and that is not the way to get ahead in society. And so there are a lot of African Americans who, in fact, denounce black power at its peak.
No matter how endlessly they try to explain it, the term black power means anti-white power. It shall not now poison our forward march.
Although he had been killed in 1965, Malcolm X had a tremendous influence following his death in the rise of the Black Power movement. If you're familiar with the terminology of the "I Have a Dream" speech, you can see that the language coming out of groups like the Black Panthers are fundamentally different than the peaceful, nonviolent, integrationist goals. Here we're talking now about expressions of Black nationalism, Black independence. We don't need the whites community if they will just leave us alone. Ultimately, though, the Black Panther movement faced a tremendous amount of pressure from the United States government, which contributed to the collapse of the movement. The movement had far-reaching consequences, though, in the validation of Black culture in the 1970s in both popular media, or an expression of something like "Black is beautiful."
Wearing my natural gives me more pride within myself. Isn't it beautiful?
What are you?
I'm black and beautiful.
Black is Beautiful was an effort to sort of throw off the shackles of the way white supremacy constructed black bodies. They're not as intelligent, They're not human, they're not as beautiful, they're not valued. So to undo that, one has to directly attack that ideology.
Black is Beautiful came out of the Black Power movement.
Right on, brother.
But it quickly permeated the American cultural mainstream. Blackness, or soul, became the epitome of cool in popular films, music, and advertising. By 1969, there were black characters on 21 primetime TV shows. But more than any other program, the syndicated television show Soul Train, created and hosted by visionary entrepreneur Don Cornelius, helped spread the idea that black was beautiful. Soul Train brought black music, dancing, and fashion into homes across America. For African American youth, it was a revelation to see kids like themselves on national television.
Soul Train was pretty much the obsession in every household in my neighborhood. I guess you could say Soul Train was kind of the first non-minstrel based black entertainment that, you know, America really got.
And it was more than just music and dancing. Soul Train and its sponsors advertised products for black consumers in ways that appealed to their new pride and identity.
Don Cornelius used the commercials to educate and promote Afrocentricity, which was something that was absolutely not heard of.
There's one with Frederick Douglass.
And Frederick Douglass teaching you how to,
But my brother, you can't go out looking like that.
Well, Mr. Douglas, you know, times have changed. We wear the natural now.
You call that a natural? That's a mess.
Kids used to tease you by saying, you're African. No, I'm not. I'm a beat you. You know, that was the reason for a fight. Someone called me African. I'm beating somebody up. Don Cornelius, his master plan was to change the lives of black youth without them knowing it. I don't mean it lightly when I say that self-love was probably the most important lesson that was taught on the show.
A recurring theme of our lesson today is that the success of the African American civil rights movement inspired a lot of similar groups to make efforts to improve themselves. And one of those groups that clearly was near the bottom of society was American Indians. Here is a video looking more at the American Indian movement.
Since its founding in 1968, the American Indian movement had been divisive, its militant tactics controversial even among Native people. Created in Minneapolis by young urban Indians fed up with police harassment, the group had shown a knack for generating publicity. Members had seized high-profile symbols, Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, Mount Rushmore, and in November 1972 had occupied and vandalized the Washington headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
I was ready to do whatever it takes for change. I didn't care. I had children, and for them, I figured I could make a stand here.
They were up to no good. I mean, why would they be traveling in a caravan with all these weapons and all these Molotov cocktails if they weren't going to engage in some kind of destructive activity?
By the 1970s, Native people, once masters of the continent, had become invisible, consigned to the margins of American life. Their anger and frustration would explode in Wounded Knee.
We were about to be obliterated culturally. Our spiritual way of life, our entire way of life was about to be stamped out. And this was a rebirth of our dignity and self-pride.
For the next 71 days, Indian protesters at Wounded Knee would hold off the federal government at gunpoint. Media from around the world would give the siege day-by-day coverage, and Native Americans from across the nation would come to Wounded Knee to be part of what they hoped would be a new beginning.
the message that went out is that a band of Indians could take on this government. Tecumseh had his day, and Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and we had ours.
The American Indian movement had a lot of obstacles that the African American civil rights movement did not have. First off would have been sheer population. If African Americans were 14 or 15% of the United States population, Native Americans were under 1%. If segregation was a thing in American society where there were blacks and whites on opposite sides of the town, this allowed for opportunities like the Montgomery bus boycott. The geographical remoteness of many Native reservations and people really eliminated a lot of these attempts. And because that natives were located, reservations were located essentially under federal care, it brought them into continual conflict with federal law enforcement agencies, as you can see in the siege of Wounded Knee. In the end, Native Americans got very little for all of their high-profile agitation, and Native Americans today continue to be at the bottom of American society. Likewise, inspired by the African American civil rights movement, was a new wave of women's rights that we call, in retrospect, second wave feminism. This movement was notable in both its size and the tremendous amount of success that it experienced. You may recall that the women's movement, beginning in England and spreading to the United States, had its origins in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. This culminated in a successful movement that by 1920 accomplished for women the political right to vote. The so-called suffragettes would be seen in retrospect as the first wave of women's rights activists. By the 1920s, they experienced those who were pushing the boundary of new cultural expectation, the so-called flappers. But this came to a halt in 1929 when the staggering economic realities of the country forced women into much more of a survival mindset than continued agitation and activism. We saw women having newfound importance in World War II with the archetype of Rosie the Riveter, with tens of millions of men preoccupied. Women had new opportunities to serve as well as have increased economic freedom. But after the war, the expectation for women was not continued empowerment, but instead we had tremendous pressure towards marriage and the baby boom. And these women then seemingly had everything. They had physical security in the suburbs. 98% of marriageable women were married. And these women, they had their children. Life should have been everything that they had hoped for. And yet Betty Friedan wrote a book capturing what she called the problem without a name, discontentment that women were experiencing. And she published it in her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. As this generation of women that survived the Depression and World War II raised their baby boom children, they raised them with a vision for more. And that vision for more became the origins of second wave feminism. Here now is a video that will expand on the origins and the nature of the second wave feminist movement.
Something had started that was beginning to spread, a new kind of pride, identity, and consciousness that was about to turn the mass movements of the 1960s into new and different forms of activism.
The women's movement had many origins. In part, it owes its renewed birth to the civil rights movement, because there was then a lesson for the women of America of how blacks at that time were taking their life into their own hands.
Is my bacon ready yet? 20 past 8. Some more toast, team.
Hey, team, why don't you get cracking on a thorough fall house cleaning campaign around here? Get the floors waxed, get the windows washed, get this place looking as if civilized people are in residence, Gee, that's a little light, isn't it?
Sorry, I hurried it.
Sweetie, have a little more damson and plum preserves, please.
In 1970, America was still very much a man's world. More women than ever were joining the workforce, but at the same time, they were still expected to be the traditional housewives and mothers of a generation earlier. In some states, women could not obtain credit cards or mortgages without a male cosigner, and nationally, they were paid an average of 59 cents for every dollar a man earned. In short, American women were still second-class citizens.
A moment in which all this prior organizing exploded was in 1970. It was the women's strike. The theme of it was, "Don't iron while the strike is hot." And there was a massive demonstration for women's rights.
Well, the main demand, of course, is equal rights to have a job, to have respect, to not be viewed as a piece of meat, equal rights to set forth our own humanity, equal rights to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. We're the bottom third of the employment in terms of pay. We represent, nonetheless, 34% of the workforce, yet we're the first to be laid off and the last to be hired. There aren't frivolous demands at all. We just want what men have had all these years.
We were all feeling it. I, in particular, felt it. And I made sure that my husband knew I was feeling it. He could no longer expect me to be as his mother was with his father, because I wasn't going to do that. I wanted more. It didn't make for harmony, but it did make for change.
There were, of course, many leaders there were many faces and voices of second wave feminism. Among them was a new, large organization called NOW, and prominent women such as Gloria Steinem, who supposed that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. Among many Americans today, there seems to be a negative connotation of the word feminism. But feminism in the 1970s had this radical meaning: that a person should not be discriminated against or denied opportunity solely on the basis of gender. This claim seems less controversial in today's environment, and that shows the overwhelming success of the feminist movement. There were essentially three goals of the second wave feminist movement. The first involved equal access to education and occupations. Harvard was founded in 1636. In what year did they graduate their first woman? 1970. And so it was second wave feminism that pried open the doors for women to have access to premier males-only institutions, to open up access to women in the sciences, engineering, law enforcement, ultimately politics, the military, equal pay for equal work. In 1963, John Kennedy signed legislation that required men and women to receive equal pay. And yet, just like the social practice of segregation lagged behind the law changing in Brown versus Board of Education, women's salaries were slow to reach equality with men. Women in the 1960s earned approximately 59 cents on the dollar that men earned. One of the goals of the second wave feminist movement was to move the needle more towards equality. The last goal of second wave feminism involved the right to decide when and how often they are pregnant. This, of course, opened the door to two issues that of birth control and abortion. One of the desires of women was to find a form of birth control that did not require the cooperation of men. And this was made available for the first time in 1960 with the arrival of the birth control pill. The birth control pill was originally available only to married women, and the second wave feminist movement sought broader control over their own reproductive cycles. Among the successes of second wave feminism included the passage of Title IX in 1972, which required equality in all forms of education. The effects of Title IX were numerous and are summarized in this poster. Title IX added a lot of legal power to women's access to education and a sexual harassment-free workplace. It also had long-term ramifications in the world of girls and sports. An ongoing controversial outcome of second wave feminism involves abortion. In 1973, the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade struck down states' rights to limit abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. The justification was that a baby could not live without the mother in the first term of pregnancy, and so at that point, it was the fetus was not a legal entity, and therefore a woman had an implied right to privacy over her body. Therefore, states could not limit access to abortion. One of the unfulfilled goals of second wave feminism was the so-called Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment, which had been first proposed in the 1920s and had been pushed for by women such as Alice Paul, had a rebirth in the 1970s. The Equal Rights Amendment would have added legal protections into the Constitution equal to those provided for by race in the 14th Amendment. It would have required true equality under the law for men and women. In order to pass, it needed to be ratified by 38 of the 50 states. It fell 3 states short before the deadline of June 30th, 1982. And so the Equal Rights Amendment has not become law. There were a number of reasons why the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, but one of the underlying general ideas was that maybe race and gender are fundamentally different. Maybe there are real differences based on the sexes that we don't want to treat equally. Especially in light of Vietnam, women had to give pause to whether or not they too wanted to be equally drafted, or whether there was wisdom in providing equal funding for both battered men and battered women's shelters. A fourth area of agitation in the era is the origins of the gay rights movement. The Stonewall riots are seen as the symbolic origin of the gay rights movement.
For reasons that will always remain mysterious, it's the Stonewall riots that became the symbolic riots, which inaugurated what we call the modern gay rights movement. It's almost impossible for young gay people today to understand what it was like back then. The reason why so many gay men went to Stonewall was that it was pretty much the only dancing bar in town. But as soon as the lights went on, that was the signal. Stop at once. Because what would happen would be unannounced police raids. The police would often just barrel through, throw customers, throw them, push them against the side of the wall, march back and forth through the bar, spreading terror. That kind of message you internalize. There were only something like 5 or 6 cops. But this time, instead of the gay people in the bar freezing, somebody started to fight back, and that very quickly spread. So the police, themselves now frightened, took refuge inside of Stonewall. By this time, the mob outside was howling for blood, for revenge, And so it went. There were at least 3 nights over that 6-night period in which there were massive demonstrations, and the Stonewall riots became immediately symbolic.
Despite a short list of successes in areas such as San Francisco, the gay rights movement in the 1970s was largely unfruitful. The gay rights movement has happened more in your lifetime and in your viewing than it did in this era. Our last 70s social movement is environmentalism. One of the origin points of the environmental movement was a book by Rachel Carson, which was published in 1962 called Silent Spring. And why would the spring be silent? All the birds are dead. Rachel Carson's book described the growing problems of pesticides and their damage to biomes and the potential extinction of prominent species like the American bald eagle. Northeast Ohio contributed its own bit to environmental awareness with the Cuyahoga River's repeated catching on fire, which I don't have to get into the chemistry of it all, but water is not supposed to burn. And it indicated that perhaps there was some pollution in America's waterways. A growing number of politically active and environmentally concerned citizens put pressure on the federal government to create new environmental protections. Although Nixon himself, being a conservative, was not looking to expand the power of the federal government, it was his signature that went on these bills, such as the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, a centralized watchdog for environmental laws and issues. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 and has helped clean up the Cuyahoga River, among other places. And the Endangered Species Act was created in 1973. And for the first time, lists were made of endangered animals, and efforts were made to protect them. And so the venerable bald eagle was able to rebound from the edges of extinction. Okay, so there was our look at the growing culture of protest in the 1970s, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for the next part of our story.